Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. I see that a lot of people have joined, and it is coming up on 2 o'clock. So we're just going to give people another minute or two, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much. All right, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. We hope that you get a lot out of today's webinar. My name is Hope Cullen. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm the Associate Director here of Operations here at Imperial, and I work with the project management team to help satisfy all of our clients' needs. With me today is Dustin Rake. Dustin is our Ancillary Supplies Category Manager. Dustin has a long history of expertise in determining ancillary supply needs and then handling them all the way through to fruition. So welcome, Dustin.
Thank you.
Also with me today is Dan Polkowski. Dan is our Export Compliance Manager, and Dan's been with Imperial for over 20 years and really has all the expertise surrounding our logistics, compliance, regulatory associated with shipping, and really getting all of the materials and ancillary supplies where they need to be, when they need to be there. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Hope.
So today, just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. You should see on the left-hand side of your screen there is a chat feature. So if you have questions during the presentation, please don't hesitate to write those in the chat feature. We will answer them during the presentation if we're able to. If not, there should be some time at the end of the presentation, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. At the end of this webinar, you will receive a copy of these slides, and then in about a week, there will be a recording available as well. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and begin. So today's webinar really centers around ancillary supplies during our clinical trial process. And ancillary supplies are a critical part of most clinical trials. We believe that applying a systematic and structured approach to identifying and then implementing ancillary supply solutions that really helps with keeping costs down, keeping your timeline short, and really mitigating risk as you conduct your clinical trial. We believe that applying a traditional project management approach, this is an ISO guideline that was developed by the Project Management Institute, and it involves 5 process groups, and we're actually going to go through each of those process groups today, aligned with how you should conduct your ancillary supplies process during your clinical trial to really do those 3 things that I mentioned, which is keeping your costs down, keeping your timeline down, and keeping your risks low. The 5 process groups we're going to go through include initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and then closing. And so we'll address all of those individually. Before we start our first process group, we'd like to run a small audience poll, and you'll see a question come up on your screen, and then we ask that you vote and supply your answer to this poll. The question you should see up there is, are you responsible for procuring ancillary supplies? So we're going to go ahead and pause a minute and allow you an opportunity to go ahead and vote and put your answer in. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Looks like about 1/3 of you are responsible for your ancillary supplies, and the other 2/3 are not. Which is actually very aligned to what we tend to see. A lot of times ancillary supplies become somebody's responsibility even though they're not that is not their primary role. So again, thank you. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dustin, and he's really going to start with our first process group.
Hello, everyone. Again, thank you for attending. The first process group is, of course, the initiation phase, which is performed to define a new project or a new phase of an existing project, and of course to gain authorization to start the project. Initially, this is where we like to identify any needs or requests. And what we like to know is, when do you normally identify a need or a request? Is it before the project kickoff, or was it a last-minute request from the site? If it was a last-minute request from the site, we really need to ask ourselves, why was it a last-minute request? Did we assess the protocol to ensure that nothing was missed? Now, we have found that oftentimes there seems to be some confusion between the sponsor, the CRO, and sometimes the site as to who is responsible in providing certain supplies or equipment and when it is to be supplied. We also need to look at things like site feasibility, supply gaps. Now, are all sites using the same quality of supplies or equipment? Now, the reason I ask you this is because every manufacturer has specifications or specs that it has to fall into. Some have a 7% variance of tolerability, some of them have a 5%. So if measurements and numbers are very, very precise and they need to be very, very accurate, this is where we need to make sure that we're all playing on the same field with our equipment. Now, was a specific make or manufacturer of supplies determined in the protocol? If it was, do all sites have it? If not, do you know where to get it? Do you know what it's for? Now, does the site have the ability to have room for the supplies and or equipment that's going to be procured or needed?
Justin, didn't we have a situation like that recently?
Yeah, actually we did. We had a client that requested a specific refrigerated centrifuge, and it was vetted. Everybody was happy with it. It got to the site, and of course, it took up too much square footage for the site. Now, it was a desktop model, but their desktops were cluttered, and honestly, they just didn't have the room for it. So it needed to be then returned, of course, back to us. And this is a costly process to have this done. And then we had to go out and basically vet another ancillary piece of equipment or centrifuge for them to use at the site. This moves us into the planning phase. Planning phase is required to establish the scope of the project. Now, this really should take the most of your time. Good planning really equals good execution. Now, did you review the list of supplies that were needed? Did we find any needs that were not listed? Do you understand what exactly is being asked for? Now, the reason I ask these things is because sometimes, let's say a fundus camera. Someone will call it a mydriatic retinal camera. Some will call it a non-mydriatic retinal camera, and some will call it a fundus camera. Now, believe it or not, these all are slightly different variations of the same thing, but they all do slightly different things. That being said, understanding what they're really asking for is really crucial at that point. Do you know where you're going to procure the items that are listed? Are you going to get them from a vendor, a manufacturer, a distributor? These are crucial things that you need to know. Will you have to worry about reporting any of these items? Now, when I say that, in the United States, of course, we have the Sunshine Act reporting, which is very crucial, very important piece of reporting that you have to get done here in the United States. And Hope will talk about this later on. But what a lot of people don't know is outside of the country, there are also other reporting structures that have to be followed as well. We also make sure that we identify the use case. Now, when people say they want a centrifuge, we have to understand, can it be a fixed or a variable speed centrifuge? Is it going to have a max speed rotation or a minimal speed rotation? Are you going to measure it in G's or RPMs? Does it need to be standard or refrigerated? Can it have a fixed bucket or can they swing out buckets? Something as simple as you would think an incubator, where you're going to just simply incubate something up to a temperature, a set temperature. All incubators are not created the same. So is it a CO2 incubator is it a CO2 jacketed? Is it air jacketed? Or is it water jacketed? Do you really need to worry about humidity levels? Do you want a gravity style or a convection style? Are you doing slides or petri dishes? Now, why do you need to know this? Well, if you're doing slides that you're going to be incubating, generally you don't want a convection style incubator. This is because the movement of the air actually dries out the slides and dries out the study, so that when you go to actually look at it under a microscope, it becomes what they call crystallized, or it starts to look, let's just say, opaque. So it's hard for them to read. We have found that clients who come to us, they'll ask for, let's say, an infusion set. Now, they'll usually say, I want this infusion set, and the reason they do that is because it's latex-free, DEHP-free, or it has a certain number of injection sites or a certain length they want. But the problem is that not all infusion sets are created equal, meaning that B-Braun sets usually don't work with a Baxter pump, or vice versa. And the reason this is so that the manufacturer, of course, can sell you infusion sets right along with their infusion pump. Now, after we've done our list, we've checked it twice, we want to make sure we identify any country requirements. What kind of power supplies are they using, and what kind of plug types? Now, Your power supplies in the United States, of course, generally 120 volts, 60 hertz. Outside of this country, it varies anywhere from 220 up to 240 volts, sometimes 50, sometimes 60 hertz. Plug types can get anywhere from A down to G. So A and B is usually a US plug, G or an F is usually a European type style plugs. And we also want to check country allowability. Is the piece of equipment or supply you're looking for, is it CE marked for the European Union? Is it FDA cleared for the United States? Is it TGA compliant in New Zealand? Is it NHS compliant for the UK? Basically, you want to make sure that you are in compliance for whatever country safety group you happen to be in. Now, we have found that compliance is not always thought about. We have seen equipment such as ultrasonic nebulizers. Now, these were specifically chosen by one of our clients. Problem is that manufacturer of that specific ultrasonic nebulizer was not NHS registered, which means any hospital in the UK cannot use that piece of equipment in their hospital because it is not part of the NHS registration. Now, what does that mean? That means we delay the study on that site. We now have to vet a whole nother ultrasonic nebulizer. We have to bring back the other ultrasonic nebulizer, and this can be very costly. We've even had entire studies held up just because of a specific model of a syringe, which did not get FDA clearance for use in the U.S. This, of course, will then move us to the execution phase.
So, Dustin, as we're talking through planning before we move to execution, there's a lot of technical details that really have to be thought about. And I know you've named quite a few, but there's some other non-technical situations that also need to be considered during the planning phase. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So some of the things that I think you and I have talked about, and that when you're dealing with ancillary supplies you need to be aware of and think about are expiration requirements. A lot of equipment and supplies do expire, particularly in the medical arena. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
So some of the things to think about is, what is the study duration? Is it a 2-year study? And if it is, how long is the expiration of the materials that you're trying to procure? If you have blood collection tubes that expire within 12 months, then you really need to think about what your procurement and distribution plan is so that you're minimizing the amount you're buying up front that won't get utilized because they expire. So really, you have to marry up your study timeline and associate that with the products and the product life usage. The other thing that you probably have to marry up is your logistics timeline. And Dan's going to talk about this here in a few minutes, logistics in depth. But that timeline can really vary depending on the country and the type of equipment or supplies you're getting into the country. So understanding what those requirements are during the planning phase will really help you to ensure that you're buying smart so that you're maximizing the utilization of those products and not wasting money and causing delays, as Dustin mentioned, by maybe not having the right supplies when you need them, or finding out later that your supplies have expired and you have to start again. Sunshine Act reporting, Dustin mentioned this earlier. We have found in our experience that a lot of people don't plan for this. Understanding what your company's interpretation of the Sunshine Act laws or the Sunshine Act regulations are will really help you to not be caught unaware, so that you plan for what that reporting looks like. Some people have interpreted that regulation to be report everything associated with what's distributed to a site, everything from disposables to patient retention tools to higher expensed equipment. Others of our clients have interpreted the Sunshine Act report to be much less strict, so only a few things get reported. But understanding what your requirement is during the planning phase will really help you to stay compliant with reporting your supplies throughout the duration of your clinical trial. And then finally in planning, and we're going to talk about this as its own process group at the end, but planning for closure now will really help you to be prepared. So again, you're proactively managing your budget all the way through the duration of the study. So one of the things that we've done is to put together a list of common questions that you want to ask your ancillary supply vendor. As we saw in the poll at the beginning, only 1/3 of the people who are on the webinar today are really involved as part of their role in procuring ancillary supplies. For many people, it's something that's done ad hoc, or it's given to them because it came up, or they're just not well versed in it because they don't do it often enough. So this list of questions should really help you to determine if you're partnering with somebody who can help you to really achieve your goals effectively. Some of the things that you want to ask are, what is your vendor supply chain relationship with manufacturers?
The thing is, you want to be careful with this is to make sure that, whoever your vendor is or whoever your supply chain is that their relationship with their manufacturers, make sure that they don't have what I like to call a dog in the hunt. There's no agenda for them. They don't have a shelf full of, let's say, specific model infusion pumps where they just say, hey, this is what you need, because they're trying to get them off their shelf. You got to make sure that they're going to do what's right for you and what's best for your needs.
Thank you, Dustin. That's a great point. Some other questions to ask your potential supply partners are, do you maintain a warehouse? And if they do, some of the things associated with their warehouse, what is the security like? Is it climate controlled? Is it have the appropriate storage space for the kinds of equipment and supplies you're maintaining? In what locations do they have the warehouse? Is it in a very rural location where FedEx or small parcel carriers can't easily come to pick up supplies? That's a logistics consideration. Is it in a region that's easy to export from or import to? Another question is, how do I access my inventory? Are you relying on somebody at that ancillary supply vendor to tell you what you have, or can you see it for yourself through a self-reporting or an online portal of some type? Ask them how your inventory is going to be managed. If you have things like expiration that you're taking into account during your study planning, is your vendor going to be able to meet those needs, ensuring that they're only sending stuff out that has the appropriate level of lifetime left on that supply, or are they just going to send out whatever's on the shelf? What types of repackaging support does your ancillary supply vendor offer? If you have a product that only comes in cartons of 1,000 and you only need to send 10 to the site, can it be repackaged appropriately? And can it maintain all of its properties if it's repackaged? And does your ancillary supply vendor know that? If it's sterile, is it going to maintain its sterility? If it is CE marked, is repackaging going to change the CE marking? So all of those types of repackaging requirements. And then finally, the last two questions center around logistics support. What is the logistics support that your ancillary supply vendor is going to be able to provide and assist you with to make sure that when you're partnering with that vendor, not only can they get the supplies that you need, but get them to the place they need to be for you?
Thanks, Hope. Now, this, of course, will lead us into the execution phase. Now, you've asked all the questions, you've planned, and now you're looking into execution. Now, where are you going to procure your supplies? Do you know from where? Is it going to be a manufacturer, distributor, a mix of both? And how is it going to be shipped to you? Are you going to get it from multiple different vendors and manufacturers and have multiple shipments all coming to one place? Are you going to have them all drop shipped out? And what are your lead times going to be? Remember, things like special orders, they can take anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes up to 14 weeks. We found that special orders, especially in things like sodium chloride, where it's the 250 ml or the 500 ml bag, these are really getting hard to come by. And they've really delayed a lot of studies because they waited so long to order. Now, can you procure these items inside the U.S., or do you need to be able to procure outside of the U.S.? Remember, if the FDA has not cleared it, you're not going to get it into the country. Even if you promise that you're going to ship it outside of the country for use, it's not coming in. Now, what are the best packaging or quantities available? You got to make sure your mins and your maxes for your site are the best, that are best for them. Is it going to be sterile or blister pack? Or what kind of packaging are you going to use when you go to ship these items? Now, you also want to make sure that you consider your inventory management procedures. Now, this is, again, ordering mins and maxes, but you want to set these things up front. You want to know that when I get down to a minimum number, that I automatically order up to whatever I consider to be my maximum number. And what are those quantities going to be? Remember, you also have to worry about expiry management. You got to forecast those things into pre-order. Many clients want us to manage that for them. And the reason is you don't want to have a study put on a delay simply because your syringes were out of date. Now you have to reorder, and heaven forbid they're a special order. Now, once that is all considered, you have to worry about your importation requirements. And this is where Dan can really help us to get a better understanding of those complexities.
Thank you, Dustin. Good afternoon, everybody. So as you heard from both Hope and Dustin regarding the various details and areas of concern that you want to research for the initiation, planning, and execution process, my role here is to assist in the execution process. And at this time, I'd like to spend some time discussing and defining what is a consignee and the role of and the responsibility of consignee. So with traditional exports, the consignee is the buyer or the seller of the goods, or a business or a person who receives the goods. However, in the clinical export-import business, the clinical shipments do not fall under the traditional import-export process due to no sales transaction is taking place in country. Only a service is being provided for your imported goods. So when you look upon the traditional import-export process, 85% of the world's exports are who's ever receiving the goods is buying the goods or turning around and selling the goods. And in the clinical field, that is not the case. A service is being performed. There is no sales transaction. So it's critical when exporting your ancillary supplies to another country that your recipient, or in this particular case we'll say the consignee, is registered with the country customs as a registered importer. If your consignee is not registered importer, the shipment will be placed in customs clearance delay or a hold pattern until a proper registered importer is assigned in country. Country customs assigns tax ID numbers to an individual or a firm or a legal entity that will be responsible for articles of trade from a foreign source into their domestic market in the course of a trade. The importer of record, the IOR, this is a very, very critical area. I used to say it was very important. Now I use the word critical because many of the clients in the clinical studies miss the role of the importer of record. So I will take some time to define a little bit more in detail the role of an importer of record. So an IOR in the export compliance business is the importer of record. It's critical to understand that the role of the importer of record is the legal entity responsible for ensuring that the imported goods comply with local laws and regulations, filing completed duty entry and associated documents, and paying assessed import duties and other taxes of these goods. However, the role of the IOR varies from country to country. In some, the sponsor is the only identity that can assume the role of an IOR, while in other countries, the IOR can be a third party, such as a clinical research organization or a distributor. That's why it's important to understand the role of an importer in every country to which the clinical studies are shipped to. So, in regards to the countries that only allow the role of an importer, there's an example where if you have to ship to a depot, and the depot is the consignee who's not a registered importer, in South America, the airway bill will have to be supported for the importer of record because they are the financial responsible party in country to deal with customs issues. Now going into the paperwork preparation phase for your international documents. It's important to ensure that all your international documents includes the required details. Necessary documentation often includes a pro forma or a commercial invoice. Pro forma invoices are used for all prior approval communications before exportation. Pro forma invoices represent a quote of a shipment to come into country, while a commercial invoice supports the commercial representation of goods coming into the country. Both the commercial invoice and the pro forma invoice require the same particular detail of information. That detail that would need to be used on the documents would be for who are the business parties involved, who is the owner of the goods, who's going to receive the goods, is it going to be the consignee, Who's the registered importer for the goods? Commodity description of the goods, the harmonized tariff number assigned for each of the commodities for your ancillary supply goods, the declared value of the goods, and please note that the declared value is the proper value for declared value is the value that one paid to have the goods manufactured, or the amount that a manufacturer invoiced the client to manufacture the goods. Also included would be the unit price of each good combined with its total price. So, other area on the international documents would be the commercial terms. In other words, who's going to be responsible for the liability of the shipment from the time it leaves the port of export to the time that it arrives in the port country. So, it's very important to understand who is the responsible party that's going to assist the courier or the carrier for clearing the goods in country. Who's going to be responsible for paying for the customs and duties and VAT clearance charges imposed on the goods. So even though there's not a sales transaction taking place, your import shipments into countries will be assessed duties and VAT taxes. The list of detail that I just described that would be used to support your performing commercial invoices, these are all standard requirements needed by each country governments during the importation process. Other additional documents needed for your ancillary supplies may require the certificate analysis, or a certificate of conformity, or possibly a country of origin certificate. Such documents will be required prior to customs clearance to support the detailed information required by country customs.
Dan, didn't you have some other examples of some specific documents associated with ancillary supplies?
Absolutely, Hope. And regarding the certification analysis and the certificates of conformity and the country of origin certificates, it's very important to note that the ancillary supplies that contain or involve electronics or measurable or measuring devices or Class II medical devices, these all typically will fall under these certification processes. These certificates will vary by country. Also keep in mind, before exporting your ancillary supplies, you may want to consider seeking pre-approval of your documentation with your registered importer in country. Your registered importer will seek counsel from their assigned registered customs broker in country before the exportation. So when the goods arrive, the registered importer will seek the power of attorney with their broker in country to assist in the clearance process with the courier, carrier, and customs. To continue on, you need to bear in mind the importance of the country of origin certificates for ancillary supplies being conducted in countries. These documents are required in order to prevent importation of materials of non-approved.
So, Dan, didn't we recently have a situation of this type?
Yeah, we've had several actually. An example would be you have ancillary supplies containing batteries that were manufactured in China. Some countries will request these batteries to be removed from the ancillary supply prior to exportation due to their country's import laws and regulations don't allow it, or the licensing requirement is too involved and they don't want to pursue one. And so this will vary within the specific regions of the world and the individual countries. So I would say that more than the amount would be probably your Central and South America regions will require these certification processes, as well as Eastern Europe or Western Asia regions. So it's important that you're communicating and you're sharing of best practices and standards of operating procedures. Your SOPs will play a major role in your success. Best practice is to ensure in advance that everyone involved in your supply chain knows what ancillary supplies are expected to arrive in country and in the most efficient time period. It's important to know that the export rules before importing. Know restrictions about returns and destructions of your ancillary supplies, which differ amongst countries. Consider, for example, Taiwan's prohibition on export of unused trial materials. Clinical sites neither have the desire nor the resources to deal with excess trial materials. Restrictions about returns and destructions exert additional pressure on your sponsors to accurately forecast the quantity of ancillary supplies needed for your clinical study, thereby minimizing waste. And finally, there are regional idiosyncrasies. There's differences of language, working patterns, culture, and religion that add another layer of complexity. So while they're challenging, none of these obstacles is insurmountable. Navigating them successfully requires a well-defined, sustainable process capable of mitigating risk from the beginning to the end of your supply chain. You need to rely on your core group of local partners and staff for the in-country of where you're importing. Carefully vetting the local in-country partners and in-country staff are among your supply chain's professional greatest assets. In addition to speaking the local language and providing hands-on support, your registered importer will be key in maintaining relationships with the regulatory and customs officials in country, while keeping the knowledge of the database for your ancillary supplies, since the rules change frequently, if not yearly. Your local partners and staff can also provide early warnings about proposed or impending changes that can impact your clinical supply logistics and budgets. So in closing, in other words, who is responsible for doing what and when? A clear understanding of the roles and the responsibilities is essential to avoid confusion, redundancy, mistakes, and delays. Reconfirm everything in advance. Going the extra mile to reconfirm arrangements and details may appear to be overkill, but doing so prevents last-minute surprises and provides peace of mind. Clearance of your ancillary supplies through country customs may require substantial advanced preparation, including a thorough knowledge of the laws, proper documentation, and a clear and well-defined process. And again, this will vary by each country. So I just want to reinstate that it's better to be proactive than to be reactive. So I hope this information of this section of the webinar regarding the execution has been educational and resourceful to your needs.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dan. And hopefully everybody took away a little piece of your expertise in that regard. Before we go to our next process phase, which is monitoring and controlling, we're going to have another poll here come up for you. And if you could just take a minute when the poll question does come up and go ahead and vote or input your answer. Okay, so appearing on your screen, you should see what percent of the time do you spend dealing with ancillary supply issues. So if we could just take a minute while you go ahead and respond. Okay. So thank you very much for doing that. It looks like the vast majority of you, or all of you, really spend 25% or less than your time in dealing with ancillary supply issues. So that's a great thing. What it means is, although many of you from our first poll are not necessarily the primary person responsible for ancillary supplies, when you do have to deal with it, it doesn't appear to be an overwhelming issue for you. So that's great to hear. So we're going to go ahead and turn to our next process group, and that is really monitoring and controlling. And this occurs all throughout, even though this is a formalized process step within the project management guidelines, it does occur all throughout all of your other process steps. And this process step actually gives you the ability to course correct as you go. So some of the things you want to consider is advanced identification of problems that may arise. While you were doing your planning, did you actually think about how to plan for problems that came up? What is the identification process if there are problems? What is the communication plan? And what is the escalation plan to get a resolution in place? So all of that really hopefully was thought of during the planning process so that you can identify them as soon as they arrive. But regardless of how much planning you do, sometimes you can't plan for everything during the planning phase, and problems will come up that you didn't anticipate. Recognizing those problems early is pretty critical to driving resolution so that your timelines, costs, and risk are minimized. One of the things that we've seen come up is something as simple as a data logger. And these data loggers that monitor the temperature of the medication when a patient takes it home, they are a piece of electronic equipment, even though some are fairly simple in how they're developed. That being said, not everybody who is involved with handling the data loggers has been exposed to them on any level before, even though the people who are supplying them may not have recognized that. So once they got to a site, some of the sites did not know how to download the data from the data logger once the patient returned it after utilizing it for their medication. So what happened was the client had to develop an instruction plan, an instruction document, so that every site was able to utilize these effectively and therefore minimize any problems or any lack of usable data that they did need in order to complete that portion of the trial. Something else you want to consider during your monitoring and controlling phase is getting ahead of amendment requirements. We all know that amendments happen. We've seen amendments on many, many trials, sometimes up to 6, 7, or 8 amendments during the course of a trial. Statistics say that on average, an amendment can cost $1 million in all of the fallout and the cascade that it causes as a result of the amendment itself. So getting ahead of that is really key to making those course corrections during the execution while you're monitoring your project. And then finally, what is your product replacement plan? So if you have a min-max thermometer at a site, that's a different replacement plan than potentially a calibration of a scale that's on a site. If your study duration is 2 years and your min-max thermometer is only good for 12 months, then very likely that's going to be replaced. But ensuring you have a plan to replace it in advance allows for the fact that you don't have any gap in actually having monitored that refrigeration or that medication. The same thing with calibration of a scale. It's a different plan, but what is your plan to have a technician on site or to have a replacement in there prior to its calibration expiration to make sure the site can seamlessly operate during that time frame? And also part of your replacement plan is what is your plan if a product breaks or if a piece of equipment that can't be shipped back needs service? Is that all in place so that you can easily course correct as the trial progresses?
Thanks, Hope. This, of course, leads us to the closing process. This is the last process normally in the group, and it's to finalize any activities across all process groups to formally close a project or a phase. Now, like Dan had said before, this is another one of those parts where it's very good to be proactive versus reactive. Your equipment return or retrieval, are you going to have to return any of this equipment or retrieve it back from the sites? And who's going to do that for you? What pieces of equipment are you going to return or have retrieved? And what can you leave there? And where are you going to send it if you have to retrieve it? Do you know what you're going to do with the equipment or the supplies once it's returned? Will you need to destroy any of this equipment? If you do, who's going to destroy it for you? Do you need a letter of destruction? Does it need to be a certified letter? Are you going to sell the equipment? Or are you going to store it for later use? If you're going to store it for later use, are you going to bring it back to the site? Who's going to calibrate it for you? Who's going to make any minor repairs? Who's going to do any low-level disinfecting? And who's going to get it ready to go back out again for you? There's always the possibility of donating to many groups that help set up clinics outside of the country or around the world. You could also think about that as well. And now, when should you plan for this disposition? Of course, like we said before, proactive is better than reactive. And we have found that it's usually best to plan for the disposition at the beginning of the study. This will ease any process and not delay any possible favorable outcomes. Because we've had clients that have come to us and we have found buyers for their equipment for them. Unfortunately, it took so long to dot all the I's and cross all the T's on the back end that the buyer had to back out due to the time that it was taking. And these were not, let's say, inexpensive pieces of equipment. And honestly, they had never been used. They were still sitting on their shelves. And then they end up having to be given away, basically. And you also want to make sure that you don't end up with them sitting underneath your desk or stuck in a closet somewhere. So, we've had clients that have told us this, that they have, storerooms full of equipment that they don't know what to do with. So, like we said before, planning up front will help you with your budget as well. Now, at this time, I would like to say thank you again for attending, and, we hope that you found this informative, and I'm sure that Hope has more to say.
Well, thank you, Dustin. As we mentioned at the beginning of today's session, we were going to answer any questions that happened to come in along the way, and we have had a couple, so I'm just going to go ahead here. The first question that came in, I think, is for you, Dustin. What is the most unusual request for an ancillary supply that you've seen?
At this time, I don't know if I'd say unusual as far as the equipment went, but it was a specific manufacturer of syringe. And the problem was that not only was it not FDA cleared, it hadn't been cleared through the European Union. And at one point, we had to actually find a manufacturer that would agree to make the syringe to the specs of the other manufacturer so that they could use this in their study, because as you mentioned before, an amendment can cost upwards of $1 million. So,
right.
It was actually cheaper for them to buy, I think it was, I want to say 50,000 of these syringes just in order to get them made by this manufacturer than it was to get an amendment done on their protocol.
Wow. Well, thank you, Dustin. Okay, it looks like we have one more question that came in, and I think this one's for you, Dan. What are some of the most challenging regions you've had to deal with logistically?
Wow, that's a good question. Challenging regions of the world that we experience here would be your Central and South America regions, as well as your Eastern Europe regions and your Western Asia regions. So, for example, in the European Union, which should be a fairly modern area to go to import to, places like Spain, Italy, and Portugal and Greece can be challenging for your ancillary supplies. And so, anyway, so basically, those regions of the world would be where you'd want to pay attention to your details.
Well, thank you, Dan. And Dustin, it looks like there's one more question that came in. When you supply large items like centrifuges and refrigerators, do you also deal with maintenance on site?
At this time, what we would do is we would look at contracting, hopefully locally if we can, or as close to the site as possible, and have somebody perform those calibrations or any kind of services or repairs if it's a particularly large item. The smaller ones that can be shipped, it would actually be better to do what we call a repair replace, or basically what that would mean is I would send you a working unit that's already calibrated and maintained, and you would send the other one back to me, and then we would just do a round robin like that.
Well, thank you, Dustin. So at this time, I don't think there are any more questions. We absolutely appreciate you attending today, and again, you will see a copy of the slides. They'll be sent to you, and a recording of this webinar will be available online within about the next week. So we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day, and if you have questions after the fact, please don't hesitate to let us know. Thank you, Dustin and Dan, and thank you to everybody for attending. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.